Great. So welcome everybody to the first afternoon session of this long conference on uncertain times, focusing mostly on transatlantic relations, but not only transatlantic relations, but many other issues actually. This special session is actually a second part of the same issue we discussed in the morning. This is the future of liberal international order. Whether we have a liberal international order, that's another issue, or whether it was just for a short period. So what is the rule and what is the normal situation? That's a theoretical problem as well. We already discussed it from a more theoretical perspective by Veronika Angel, and then we discussed, let's say, more accurate, concrete political problems, especially from the side of Roland Freudenstein and Thibaut Muzier, both of them speaking about great power politics and also mentioning a lot of problems coming from illiberalism, especially Hungary and Poland. And I think we will somehow continue this topic now, and I might go back to some issues which were already raised in the morning to make a connection, but all our three speakers are free to present their own views first of all. I can see that Julie Smith is with us from Cambridge. She's also a member of the House of Lords from the side of the Liberal Democrats. Jacek Kucharczyk is here as well. Both of you are old friends of the Hungarian Europe Society, and maybe I can say personally as well. So it's great to have you with us. And I am not sure whether our third speaker, Oana Popescu-Zamfir, who was here in the morning, actually, or I saw her on my screen, is not yet here with us, but I would suggest to start, and she can join us later, hopefully in a couple of minutes, because we otherwise would run out of time. So first of all, I would like to ask Julie to make a presentation. We gave the title, a very general title, Global Europe, Global Britain, to your presentation. Actually, Brexit was already mentioned in the morning as a sort of influence on EU-US relations for the future, since Britain has now a special space in this international arena. Oana, welcome. Oana Popescu-Zamfir is with us as a third speaker. Great to have you here, also an old friend of the Hungarian Europe Society. So the idea is that Julie will make her presentation first, then it's you, Oana, and thirdly, Jacek will speak about mostly about Central Europe. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Julie. Please go ahead.
Thank you, István. One of the peculiarities of the COVID world is that we can be in almost two places at once. So I have literally come off one Zoom call where I was talking about referendums and the future of Europe, organized by the University of Leuven, and come straight to Budapest without having to leave my office in the House of Lords. This has the huge advantage that I can be with you this afternoon. It has the downside that I wasn't with you this morning, and it has the further downside that I'm not meeting you in person. And I was aware before the recording started that the panelists were having a little bit of banter, which I think other participants will have heard. And I was talking about the sadness of having Zoom meetings, which might be very useful in terms of us being able to interact, to say what we think and put forward views. But one of the things that we miss is the side conversations. And the reason I'm rehearsing that point now isn't because I think it's something that is just about the social, just about the personal in a private sense, but that it's actually something that matters hugely for international relations as well. And the act of Brexit means that many side conversations can no longer happen, and that this is something that I think is a problem for the United Kingdom, and I'm going to suggest might be a problem for global Britain. So that at the moment, the world is in a very strange place where it's very easy to meet frequently, all online. And at the moment, that is fine because we're working with people perhaps that we know. István was saying that all the panelists are old friends, that we've worked together. But we've worked together because we've met each other in the past in person, in Budapest or at international events in London, elsewhere. You get to know people and then you say, oh, actually, I'll invite that person again. And that works at an academic level. It also works at a political level. It works within the European Union. And that's one of the things that Brexit has damaged. When the Prime Minister, or the now Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, was campaigning to leave the European Union, he was very gung-ho about what would happen. He could only see some sunlit uplands, the great things that were going to be achieved by Brexit. He then became Foreign Secretary under Theresa May when she took over as Prime Minister in 2016. There was a bit of a sense that Theresa May had tried to put in post in the international posts that were dealing with Brexit, the advocates of Brexit, on the basis of you broke it, you fix it. It was David Davis as the Brexit Secretary. It was Liam Fox as the Minister for International Trade. And it was Boris Johnson as Foreign Secretary. And as Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson was very keen to talk about global Britain. And at that time, I was on the International Relations and Defence Committee of the House of Lords, and we were doing an inquiry into essentially Britain's place in the world, called UK Foreign Policy in a Shifting World Order. When we started it, we didn't necessarily know that Brexit was going to happen. It was commissioned the month before the referendum. But during the time of the inquiry, we took evidence from various people, including the then Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson, who was very keen to tell us that the UK was going to be east of Suez for the first time in 50 years, which he clearly thought was a very good idea. That this would be part of global Britain, that this would be part of a United Kingdom unshackled from the European Union. Somehow the European Union had been preventing the UK from trading with other countries, from exporting its values, from exporting its military equipment and other things. Somehow, for the Brexiteers, European Britain precluded global Britain. And so that rhetoric, that sloganizing of global Britain came to the fore. But our cross-party committee, chaired by a Conservative, nonetheless said, the slogan global Britain is meaningless. We don't really know what it means. It needs some substance. And there was quite a lot of skepticism about why the United Kingdom needed to be east of Suez and what that would really mean. Now, it so happens that we have two new state-of-the-art aircraft carriers, the Queen Elizabeth class carriers, one of them called HMS Queen Elizabeth, which was sent off to the South China Sea, stopping off in the Middle East and so on. Whether it needed to go to the South China Sea, whether it was for any political reasons or diplomatic reasons, or whether it was security reasons, or whether it was just posturing, are something that I think is open for debate. But it was very much something that fitted with the symbolism of global Britain. At the same time, the United Kingdom did acknowledge that it wanted to have strong defence relationships still with France in particular. So during the post-war period, only two European states, I would suggest, and I apologise to Poland and the Baltic states, Bulgaria and Romania, all of whom might say, but we put our money into NATO. But if you think about the size of the defence budgets of France and the United Kingdom. They were the two countries that still wanted global reach. In the case of the UK, the hope was global reach on our own or in conjunction with the United States. For France, it was through Europe. So the two countries in many ways had very similar ambitions, but had different routes. A European route for France, a transatlantic route for the United Kingdom. But over the last 20 years, France and the UK have tried to strengthen their defence cooperation. And both had said, this is something that we really want to keep going even after Brexit on a bilateral basis. The nature of Brexit had meant that many of the relationships that the UK had built up over the last 40 years were damaged. That inevitably, one fact of Brexit, one inevitable consequence of Brexit, is that ministers and civil servants are no longer in the room when decisions are taken. And that's very obviously a consequence of Brexit. If you're not a member state, you're not in the room. Everybody could predict that consequence, and it was inevitable. What was also inevitable but not really thought about was the fact that if you're not in the room for the formal negotiations, then you're probably not in Brussels or in a national capital for the wider discussions. You're not there for the coffee breaks and the tea breaks. You're not getting to know your colleagues. And at the moment, there is still quite a lot of connection between the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of Germany, the President of France. Even if the Prime Minister of the UK and the President of France have spats periodically, they know each other. But as Germany is debating who its new Chancellor is going to be, as France looks to the presidential elections next year, gradually those personal connections will become weaker. And so the idea of global Britain is great rhetorically, but we were already endangering our closest relationships and our clearest security relationships with our European neighbours. And here I differ from the government. I don't happen to think that our strongest security relationship is with Australia. I think it is actually with France and with our European partners, because even if we've left the European Union, our geopolitical interests don't change. We are still barely 20 miles from France, but we are still a European country and our security interests remain the same. So having very strong relationships with France and with the rest of the EU, either bilaterally or for many through NATO, was and remains important. The rhetoric of global Britain, I would say, is just that. And the recent experience of the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, to me, suggests that it is more important than ever that the UK should be working closely with France and the European countries, other European countries. Because ultimately, what the US withdrawal from Afghanistan suggested was that the US isn't going to listen to the UK. It was easy to assume that under Donald Trump, America was shifting from the liberal international order. The assumption was with Biden that that might come back. The reality is that the US can be a hegemon. It doesn't need to listen to the United Kingdom, and it's turning towards isolationism on the one hand, but to the extent that it's interested in multilateralism, it's to the Indo-Pacific. Global Britain, therefore, is pivoting to the Indo-Pacific following the US. We've now got AUKUS, the relationship between Australia, the UK, and the US. It's partly a trade deal. It's partly about exporting technology to Australia, but it's being marketed in the UK as this big opportunity for the UK to work with its closest security partners. But I think we have to ask, is the UK really strengthening its own security by supporting Australia having nuclear-powered submarines near to China? Is this really in the UK's interests? I'm not sure. So I think global Britain is beginning to take on an identity and a shape, but it's not one that necessarily makes it safer or more secure. While at the same time, the concept of a global Europe is one that's rather different, because it's far less about military capabilities and more about influence and values. But the problem that Europe has, as the United Kingdom has, and to an extent the US, that seeking to export values is something that we've been doing for decades, in particular in Afghanistan. And what we've seen is you can't simply export values. And so for both the UK and for Europe, I think there are question marks about what being global means and how effective we can be. But having said that, the opportunity for Europe is that if being global is about development aid, if it's about soft power, then the European Union is, I think, going about it in the right way. Whereas the UK's decision to cut its development aid, claiming the COVID crisis is the reason, is probably sending the wrong signal. If we are strengthening our military, but we're not strengthening our soft power, that doesn't necessarily help global Britain in a meaningful sense, even if it does rhetorically. So I'm aware I talked far more about global Britain than about global Europe. I'm happy to come back much more to the European side of things in questions, but I thought my comparative advantage here was probably to talk a bit more about the UK.
Well, thank you, Julie. Certainly, we will talk about global Europe later on, and I already have questions to you, but I think it's better to make the first round for all the three of you, and then come back to global Britain's problem, and the issue of global Europe will be discussed by everybody, I think, and we cannot avoid to mention the consequences of Brexit either, I think, for all of us. So, Jana, the floor is yours. You are the, I have prepared myself to make a correct introduction about you. You are the director of GlobalFocus Center in Bucharest, and also a Europe's Futures Fellow at the Institut für die Wissenschaften for Menschen in Vienna at the moment. So the floor is yours, and please go ahead. I think your topic is very similar to Julie's in the sense that when we talk about geopolitics, it's very much connected to Julie's argumentation, a shrinking space for Britain actually after Brexit, when we face such challengers like Russia and China. And I know that you wouldn't focus especially on Central Europe, but if you mention it, that's even better. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, István. Perfect introduction, of course. And yeah, I think I will zoom out a little bit, but at the same time try to mention how we are affected by the current global changes. And I'm afraid there's shrinking space for most of us, and especially here in Europe, and not just for Central Eastern Europe. What I will argue is that the current geopolitics and geopolitical dynamics within this emerging global order will be marked by two interesting trends that are going to shape very much what is going to happen, whether in more conflictual, competitive, or more cooperative, peaceful terms in the world and in Europe. And that is, on the one hand, low intensity conflict and competition. And then the parallel trend will be a competition of systems of values. And I will take my cue from Julie's earlier introduction to argue that this doesn't necessarily mean that we need to, or that we will continue to try to export our system of values. I think it's going to be much more about a competition of models, you know, going back to the old American way of framing this as America being the city on the hill that everybody looks to and tries to emulate. And to a large extent, that is actually also China's approach throughout the centuries, or the millennia for that matter. As a rule, China, as the Middle Kingdom, has been less concerned with directly projecting influence around and more with actually being the center, the hub that nobody could live without. And since I believe the US-China opposition and tension is going to define the coming years and perhaps decades of our global order, from this will emerge the competition of systems of values that I see, because even though the US might lose its hegemonic power and capacity to exercise influence by itself in the world, at the same time it will continue to be, and I think together with Europe, I hope that it's going to be together with Europe, Europe will definitely retain that capacity to be a model of a system of development, even though we might be less able at times to project direct influence. And I think Julie has already covered that kind of shrinking space for us. So I do believe that just as other parts of the world are continuing to try and emulate the European Union model, whether for a common market or for freedom of travel or for the cooperative way of solving multilateral and bilateral issues, I think the EU will continue to retain that power as a model. And I think this is going to matter because, like I said, on the one hand, we will have the US and the EU, whether cooperating within the transatlantic relationship or not. But if we continue down the same path of development, and if we manage to maintain at least the relative health of our democracy, I think this is going to function of itself as a very important tool of influence in the world, because at the other end of the spectrum, we are going to have China as the leader, and then other junior partners, including Russia and many others, that are going to try to project an alternative system for countries to emulate, which is going to be one based on efficiency and stability. I think this is going to be the sales pitch, if you wish, which is going to try and cover the autocratic slide under the appearance of efficacy, of a system that functions, of a system that delivers, and that's going to play against the dissatisfaction that we experience in the West with our own government's capacity to deliver, and with the slow functioning of democracy, which is not always up to speed with how fast everything else around us changes. So China and its I don't know if I can say allies, because there are probably going to be changing alliances, are going to try to make a counter offer in the shape of, as I was saying, a system of governance which doesn't have to bother with all the complicated paths of democracy and elections and so on and so forth, but is able to allegedly deliver for itself and for the world in terms of goods and commodities. So I believe, on the one hand, this US-China opposition with the entire system of governance and the values around each of these two poles is going to define the geopolitics of our times. And I believe that at the same time, as I was saying, what's going to come out of that is that neither of the two powers nor other important powers in the world are going to take an interest in any sort of direct conflict, let alone war between them. War and conflict in general in our days have become costly, have become unpopular. I think even for countries that are increasingly autocratic, there is still the sensitivity of people which needs to be managed, because they are still subjected to the satisfaction or dissatisfaction of their populations, and keeping protest and rebellion to a minimum is key for an autocratic regime. So under circumstances where the average prosperity on the globe is rising, while unfortunately inequalities are also rising, people's expectations that their lives will be better tomorrow are growing as well. So that is why spending on war, conflict, and the losses, the associated losses, are something that's going to be increasingly unpopular and hard to accept for not just Western populations, as it already is, but also populations outside of the West. So what that means is that while avoiding direct and open conflict and war, big powers and even smaller regional powers are going to look for cheaper, less dangerous ways to challenge each other's dominance. And that is going to happen in several ways. On the one hand, we are going to continue to see the hybrid forms of conflict that we have already witnessed over the past years. On the one hand, cyber attacks. I think it's been proven how efficient they can be without necessarily leading to open confrontation between states. Disinformation, and I think this is going to be one of the major challenges for our societies. Even incursions of the type that we have seen with Russia in Ukraine, and perhaps attempts at border change as well. On the other hand, we're going to see this fight take place on the realm of trade. International trade is going to become a sort of a proxy for political competition between not just US and China, but also other powers. I think these days we see more saliently than before how something like the chips and conductors crisis can paralyze whole sectors of the economy and affect people very directly all over the world. I think we see in the UK, for instance, how issues related to labor force and the prices of gas and shortages can again affect people extremely directly, extremely fast. I think we have seen, for instance, with sanctions on Iran before the nuclear deal, how efficient it can be when the banks pressured by the US, which still has the advantage of the dollar being the international currency for financial flows. So how impactful it can be if you can pressure the banks to essentially take a country outside of the international financial system. So I think leaders have discovered over the past few years what a powerful force trade can be to wage political war, let's say, against their competitors without that qualifying as an aggression, as a direct aggression necessarily. On the third way that we're going to see this unfold is going to be through proxies, through third parties. Alliances are going to be shifting. I think I still believe, I still hope in the strength of the transatlantic alliance as a pillar of what we know as the Western way of life in all of its aspects. But I think we're going to see a new emergence of multilateralism. And this is a very slippery slope, because in a way it makes sense to see multilateralism come back when with with some just cause, I think, powers that ended up on the losing side after the world wars and after the Cold War now say we did not have a say in the global order as it is now, and we are different from what we used to be decades ago. So it is only just and fair that now we should have much more of a say in deciding the international system of rules and regulations. But then on the other hand, I think China and Russia, for instance, are not at this point genuinely interested in shaping a new rules-based international order that's just going to replace the existing one. I think at this point, precisely because of their domestic weaknesses, they are only interested in challenging the Western-led rules-based international order, and they are interested in challenging the rules without necessarily proposing new ones. So I don't think we are at that point in the negotiation. And I think this, the claim that they continue to make to multilateralism and its return is actually a way of saying we want to coalesce others around our interests to undermine the supremacy of the US, of the West, and so on and so forth, without really trying to play by the rules or define rules. So I do believe that we're going to see a similar response, for instance, from the US. To me, the submarines deal with Australia and the UK is part of that. It's trying to empower your allies in the Pacific to themselves be stronger against a resurgent China, so that you don't have to do everything yourself. And I believe we're going to continue to see that. And that being said, I'm not telling you anything new, but I believe it's worth repeating how important it's going to be that we will keep having domestic problems at home. They will be accelerated by climate change, by artificial intelligence and technological transformation, by demographic issues and crises. And there's going to be a whole range of observers of our weaknesses to use them against us. So increasingly what we're going to see in this low intensity conflict is going to be just making use of every wrong step that we take, of every division, polarization, dissatisfaction within our societies to undermine us from within and to use the power of people against their institutions and against their systems of governance. And to close, I think it's just worth mentioning that with regard to China, what we see is, I believe, a long game. I think China has always historically played a long game. I think it will continue to do so now. It will be a problem if that accelerates. I think if there is an acceleration of the internal problems in China, or if Xi's personality, which has so far, I think, projected more assertiveness than we were used to, is going to accelerate China's ambitions, I think that's going to be a further element of pressure on the international system, not just on the West. I think China will continue to try to increase its influence in Central Eastern Europe and the European Union. It will cause further tensions in the transatlantic alliance, and the lack of alignment between the EU and the US will further fracture our response to China's moves, as well as the Pacific focus of the United States. Again, I do believe that there is a danger now that with potentially, let's see what happens, because there are a lot of unknowns, but with potentially weaker German leadership in Europe and a more assertive France that feels where Macron feels he has space to actually project his leadership, I think there's a risk that there's going to be even less coordination with the United States, and with strategic autonomy, in my view, not materializing fast enough. I believe that is something to watch, because it will potentially cause us problems. And in our immediate neighborhood, Russia will continue to be assertive and potentially aggressive, because it has to signal that it is more than a regional actor and a junior partner to China, and an inferior, let's say, to the United States. And then Turkey is also going to continue to play multipolar politics. And in the Middle East, we're going to see multiple competitions for power. So in the immediate European neighborhood, I think we're going to see a lot of very dynamic geopolitical rearrangements under the pressure of this changing global order. So these are just a few things to watch. I don't have a lot of solutions or answers at this point, but I think it's just a bit of food for thought.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jana. That's great, and you somehow showed the complexity of the issues we are talking about. And actually, your presentation was a clear continuation of the morning debate, where, you know, it's nothing new, as you said, but sort of conclusion we can take that whatever is coming now at the international stage, it's not simply a continuation of a former Cold War, even if the conflicts between the US and China might dominate the international scene, but there are many other aspects what we have to take into account when we talk about international relations. And you mentioned values as well, which were also emphasized in the morning. And I think it's very important that maybe even when talking a little bit in a realpolitik language, values are parts of our discussion. And I think that brings us to our next speaker, Jacek. When we talk about Central Europe or East Central Europe, whatever language we use, meaning in our case with Jacek and myself, meaning mostly Poland and Hungary, talking about illiberal, semi-authoritarian regimes within the European Union and in our region, how the values we believe in and which are challenged by illiberal politicians now in government, actually, how this might influence the role of the region inside the European Union and maybe even globally. So this is the task now Jacek has to deal with, to discuss this in the next couple of minutes. And I think then we will have a broader picture from Britain to our region, and including China and Russia and everything. And then we will continue our discussion. Now, Jacek, the floor is yours.
Thank you, István, and thank you for this introductory remarks and for this opportunity to talk about the future of Central Europe inside the European Union and globally. And as you already stated, I will probably most often mention Poland because that's my comparative advantage, also Hungary, as the two troublemakers in Central Europe. So I will start by stating that as regards the future of international order, Central Europe is today more often than not perceived in Brussels, Berlin, and Washington as part of the problem and not part of the solution because of democratic backsliding in key countries of the region, like the already mentioned Poland and Hungary. And what does it mean? Does it mean that Euro-Atlantic integration has lost its power of attraction to Central Europeans, as Krastev and Holmes claim in their influential book, The Light That Failed? My answer to this question is twofold. The straight answer is no, because Central Europeans on the whole perceive global issues and actors similarly to public opinion in Western Europe, even if some of them don't really feel that they already made it to the Western Europe standards, like, for example, in social economic terms. So in this sense, the West, and especially Europe, European Union, is still the guiding light to Central Europeans. So this is my first claim. But, and there is a big but to this claim, the current state of politics in Central Europe is rightly a concern for all democratic governments and requires concerted transatlantic policy towards democratic backsliders in the region. So I would like to address these 2 points one by one, focusing on the example of Poland, as I already mentioned, because also, not because I know most about Poland, but also because I think today Poland is the biggest troublemaker in the region and probably the most important case, although Hungary is really a strong competition here. So firstly, on the basis of research which we conducted at the Institute of Public Affairs with international partners, I would like to show that the Polish public opinion on European and global issues is not essentially different than, for example, in Germany and France. Secondly, I would like to explain why, despite the above claim, I think that the so-called Polexit is now a serious challenge, not just to the EU, but to the transatlantic community, and why we need a serious debate on how to stop this disaster from happening. So, point one. In this year's edition of our annual study, PolishGerman Barometer, we asked people in Poland and Germany about their perceptions of key actors shaping the global order, the US, EU, Russia, and China. And this survey showed a somewhat surprising convergence of Polish and German views. So, to start with the EU, overwhelming majorities in both countries, in Poland it was about 80%, think that the EU is an actor contributing to international peace and stability. In Germany, the view is very much like this. Also, in both countries, a plurality, but not a majority, believes that America is a force for good. Yet significant part of the public, around 1/3, thinks that the US contributes to conflicts and instability. So once again, Poles and Germans have a very similar perception of the current situation as regards America as a global actor. The same seems to be true about Russia and China, which, according to this research, are perceived by majorities as countries or actors that undermine international order rather than as a force for or forces for stability. Here, the difference is that Germans seem to be more critical of China and Poles are more critical of Russia, but the direction or the total perception is very similar. I also wanted to mention some results of another study which we haven't published yet, and this is a study of public opinion in Poland, France, and Germany. And once again, this study shows more similarities and differences in the perceptions of the three publics concerning global and European issues. So to go back to the perception of USA, there are majorities in all three countries that consider USA as an important partner of the EU, with the French being relatively most skeptical. Also, similar percentages in all countries see Russia and China as strategic rivals of the EU. The most skeptical views on Russia are again in Poland, while China is viewed most critically in France in this case. What is most important here, I think, is the fact that support for EU membership is strongest in Poland and then followed by Germany. According to this study, the percentage of opponents of membership is highest in France, followed by Germany, and is lowest in Poland, so only 9% are opposed to EU membership. Another, this time more worrying similarity in all three countries is that pluralities, but not majorities, would like to see more powers returned to member states to safeguard national sovereignty, rather than to give the EU more powers to tackle global challenges. Once again, this is not just true about Poland, but about also Germany and France, that there are a public who perceives the current situation like this. And this last result leads us directly to the seeming paradox of why Poland has a Euro-enthusiastic public and Eurosceptic government. I wanted to first notice that this slogan of defending national sovereignty is the dominant narrative of Poland's ruling right-wing coalition in their battle with Brussels on the rule of law issue. And our research demonstrates that part of the Polish public is susceptible to this narrative. So the debate about the threat of Polexit has been simmering in Poland for several years now and erupted in recent weeks when key government politicians strongly reacted to the rulings of EU Court of Justice condemning key parts of the so-called judiciary reform, and in particular because of the suspension of approval of Poland's National Recovery Plan and the payments that should follow, which the right-wing government in Poland badly needs to sustain its dwindling public opinion ratings. So a leading member of Poland's governing Law and Justice Party said this month, and I quote, "Brussels sends us overlords who are supposed to bring Poland to order on our knees," adding that Poland will fight the Brussels occupier as it fought in the past Nazi and Soviet occupiers. So these are the exact words from one of the current leading Polish politicians, or one of the influential Polish politicians. However, when opposition leader Donald Tusk accused the government of secretly planning Polexit, Poland's de facto ruler Jarosław Kaczyński vehemently denied, stating that Poland's future is in the EU. His denial did not convince the opposition. Opinion polls show that more than 40% of Poles and a vast majority of opposition supporters believe that peace policy may end in Polexit. So 4% of the people in Poland think that Polexit is possible because of the policy of our government. Having this in mind, I still think it's remarkable that after more than 5 years of such increasingly hostile government rhetoric towards Brussels, a vast majority of Poles continue to support membership. This is also true about the majority of ruling party supporters, albeit this majority is not so impressive as the data for the public at large. So opinion research also shows that Poles support EU membership for a variety of reasons, not just because of the transfer of funds. Freedom of movement, work, and education abroad are seen as at least equally important benefits that increasing economic prosperity and infrastructural investments. What this means is that EU membership is, in my view, not a source of populist democratic backsliding in Poland. On the contrary, and I think this is the most important thing I want to say here, that EU remains the single most important factor constraining the authoritarian tendency of the current Polish government. So this is why the anti-EU rhetoric of peace politicians is always followed by denials of Polexit plans. And the current politicians play a kind of balancing act, which they have to play because they are stuck between EU punitive actions and pro-European public. It is also a balancing act within the ruling coalition, which includes hard Eurosceptics who want to leave the EU and whose votes Kaczyński needs to stay in power. This, however, brings us a truly scary similarity to Brexit, which also started as David Cameron's balancing act between the factions of the Conservative Party. The crisis in Poland may quickly escalate, especially that according to the Polish law, to exit the EU, the government does not even need to hold a national referendum. A simple parliamentary majority will suffice. So to conclude this short presentation, I think that keeping Poland and Hungary inside the EU is the crucial issue for the future of Central Europe in the global order. And this aim needs concerted action from both Brussels and also Washington. Yet the way to achieve it, and again, I wanted to emphasize this, the way to achieve it is not by cutting some slack to the authoritarians in Warsaw in Budapest, but by helping the civil society and pro-EU political opposition to restore democracy and rule of law in the region. As the old adage goes, you sometimes need to be cruel to be kind. And this should be guide to the international community and EU institutions in particular when dealing with increasingly aggressive backsliders in the region. So this is my short summary on the current challenge of making Central Europe count in the global order. I will be happy to answer any more specific questions on what I have said. So thank you again for inviting me. Thanks, István.
Thank you, Jacek, for your presentation. Certainly, there are so many similarities with Hungary, but I do not want to make another presentation about some differences and so many similarities between the two countries, which I think both of them sometimes play from the same cookbook or use each other's experiences and even consult each other what should be the next step in this, what we call in Hungary, I mean the regime calls it a freedom fight against the colonization of Brussels. So it's a very similar rhetoric. Actually, it takes longer in Hungary. Who went further on which territory? That's a nice competition between the two ruling governments, two ruling parties.
Strong competition, right?
Exactly. Well, and what you talked about shows us that when we discuss international politics and international order, liberal order, or whatever order, we shouldn't forget that there is a conflict within the European Union between protagonists of a democratic EU and the nationalist, populist, illiberals on the other side, and it's called a sort of crisis with many other crises. Many talk about multiple crises the EU has to face, and this is a global crisis or just a global transition from a period which was maybe safer for liberal Democrats than today, with ups and downs. And maybe today we can be more optimistic than a couple of years ago when Brexit happened, when Trump happened, and maybe yesterday the German elections gave us back some hope again that extremists lost a lot on both sides of the political spectrum. So maybe there is a brighter future for the European Union and in that sense, liberal order worldwide. Now, we do not have actually much time left, so we are running out a little bit of time. So I'm not sure whether we will have time enough for many questions from the audience. So let me ask instead directly Julie what she wanted maybe to speak about, how this new global Europe, with all the problems what Jacek mentioned and the external environment what Oana talked about. So global Europe, when we face conflicts within the transatlantic alliance, and a special place for Britain, whether it's global Britain or it's just an illusion of the current government, that's your story again, what you mentioned. But can Europe somehow regain its positive role on the global stage in such complicated circumstances with so many crises inside and also coming threats and risks from outside. You mentioned that maybe Britain's security interests are mostly because of its geographic position are linked to Europe, but do European geographic interests and values do not link us even to the Pacific? So whether it's not a support for global Britain argument, but it's a question about global Europe. Where are our strategic values and interests now for the future regarding all these complex problems? The floor is yours, Julie.
Thank you. Not an insubstantial number of questions there. And I think there needs to be a period of reflection for European states, including the United Kingdom, but also the US, in the wake of NATO's departure from Afghanistan, which inevitably drew reactions from China and Russia saying, well, look at what you have or haven't achieved. What you thought you were trying to do. And the difference, or a major difference, obviously, between the EU and NATO is that the EU doesn't aspire to be a military player. But the fact that the American withdrawal was associated with such a rapid demise of the Afghan government and the takeover of the Taliban leaves a residue of frustration that attempts to change values, to change norms in a country into which we put huge amounts of resources, completely collapsed. And I think some of the expectations of being able to change norms and values and engage everybody in the liberal international order have been challenged internally and externally. So in the case of Afghanistan, it's an external country where we haven't been able to achieve what we wanted. But the difficulty within the European Union is precisely the fact that Hungary and Poland, and to a lesser extent Romania and at times the Baltic states, have all looked as if maybe they don't quite aspire to the same values as the founding member states. And even within the founding member states, there are challenges. So I think there is a need to reflect on precisely what the norms and values are that the European Union agrees on. But the focus then does need to be on sanctions, it needs to be on development aid, it needs to be on soft power. Whether it should be global, I'm not sure, because I think there is a sense in which if your attempt is to be a world policeman or to engage globally, it can look undesirable to other countries. However, further engagement, for example, in Africa might be beneficial, but obviously in particular countries, not here's our Africa strategy, Africa's a continent, let's have one policy for Africa. But we could be working through how best we work with certain countries, how we support them, how we build up trust. So I think rather than having a global strategy, there needs to be an internal reflection and then a sense of let's be a little bit more strategic about how far we want to engage with other countries. And that might be working more closely with neighborhood countries in North Africa, where perhaps the European Union hasn't had the influence that it had originally hoped to have.
Great, thanks, Julie. I would like to raise the same question to Oana and Jacek, since Jacek mentioned the potential support of the EU to civil society, or a growing, increasing support to civil society actors, and maybe expressing the values, the European and Western values. The EU was based actually many years back now. So in that sense, it's evident that in both in Poland, in Hungary, and many countries around us in the region, including actually the Balkans, there is a cleavage between pro-European political forces and those who challenge the current structure of the EU, or maybe they even challenge the European Union as such. When Jacek mentioned the Polish exit, it's already an issue in Hungary as well, raised by some Hungarian politicians, even if it's the same way the mainstream and the top politicians of Fidesz deny this sort of charges coming from the opposition. So now my question is whether the European institutions and some member states, including actually the Norwegian government, which has a conflict with Hungary as well regarding civil society support, should be more clear that it would like to prefer pro-European political actors in power, like it does in the case of Belarus, which is certainly a very different case since Belarus is not a member state. But what do you think? How can play with this problem? How can the EU institutions and liberal-minded European politicians play with this? There is a lot of criticism against Orbán and Kaczynski in the international media and also by a lot of top politicians, but there is no such clear-cut support for the opposition. Now, we had a forum last week in Budapest, the Budapest Forum, where the mayor of Poland, Rafał Trzaskowski, was
Warsaw.
present. Sorry, mayor of Warsaw, certainly there is no mayor of Poland, at least not now. So Mayor of Warsaw, Trzaskowski, made a fantastic speech and made great comments on the situation of Poland, and he seemed to be a political actor who might be supported by like-minded people from all around the world when facing an illiberal government in Poland. So what do you think? Is it possible for the EU, just because of the geopolitical or international situation, since it has to somehow cope with this internal problem of illiberalism and populism, to support more openly those political forces, not only civil society, certainly civil society as well, which might bring change to the region sooner or later? Please be short because we are running out of time. Would you like to start, Jana, shortly, please?
Yes, very shortly. Look, I mean, I think it's not a matter of the EU directly helping those political forces that stand in opposition to Mr. Orbán and Kaczynski currently. I think it's about supporting those aspects of democratic resilience in our respective countries, so in our societies, in a way that we would make a very clear distinction between the societies of these countries and their governments. And I cannot emphasize more how important I think it is what Jacek just described. And I think we should refrain from saying Poland does this, thinks this, Hungary does this, thinks this, Romania and Bulgaria do this and that. This is their governments doing that. And I know there's this old political science idea that countries deserve their governments because they have voted for them. But I would hope that's been cancelled a long time ago and proven wrong. And so I think when you look at Poland, in terms of democratic resilience, you see how being part of the European Union is changing the society and has changed society tremendously in a way that while its government is backsliding democratically and taking a very dangerous direction, the country itself, I am very confident in the medium run, will increasingly become more and more European. And so I think in terms of the politics, it's essential to keep Poland and Hungary within the European Union, as hard as that might make everybody's life. But this is a guarantee that they will continue to converge toward the same European Union average that's going to make everybody's life easier in the medium term. And you and I, István, were part of the same project led by GlobalFocus Center on elaborating a democratic resilience index, which we launched last week in Brussels. And I think really the focus needs to be on analyzing which aspects in these countries are suffering and why, and what is it that the EU has not done enough and is not doing enough to make sure it consolidates democratic resilience at the level of society, at the level of the economy, at the level of the political class in general, without necessarily lending direct support to specific political forces, because that wouldn't be correct from a Brussels point of view, but making sure that societies have the internal mechanisms to generate to generate positive change from within, when the next elections give us an opportunity to perhaps change these governments.
Thank you, Jana, and thank you for mentioning our joint project led by your GlobalFocus Center in Bucharest about Democratic Resilience Index, which we together launched, as you mentioned, last week in Brussels. So there are many ways to grasp this problem. What the EU should do, actually, it's an old question, and it's just one part of it, whether to support more directly the democratic players, actors in Hungary and Poland and in other countries. But I'm very curious what will be the reaction of Jacek on this very problem we just raised. So Jacek, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. And I very much agreed with what Oana said, but I just wanted to say maybe two more things. One is, and this will be probably stating the obvious, that successful transition and integration of Central Europe into the EU was a crucial part of EU soft power, especially in the neighborhood, but not only there. So the current backsliding, and it's not just about divisions within the EU and lack of coherence on certain key values, it's also a problem for global Europe. I mean, because of the kind of image they wanted to project as projecting the values of democracy, rule of law, and yet you see you have countries which directly contradict these values at home. So I think this needs to be kept in mind every time we talk about how to deal with backsliding countries, that this is important for many reasons, including the global Europe aim. And second, what I really wanted to say is, yes, the EU cannot directly assist the opposition politicians, but I think it can be much tougher when dealing with the current government politicians. And for many years, we've seen this like pretending that a dialogue is happening between Brussels and Warsaw government. And they always pretended maybe they went to Brussels, they said something that they would never do, and there was no follow-up. So we as the public, as activists, heard a lot of tough words from European Parliament, sometimes the Commission, but then when it came to some action, there was very little action. And I think that this is a very important moment with this reconstruction fund, which the government already scheduled into its plan how to win the next elections. I mean, they basically use it as their election fund. And if you just let them do it, if you keep talking about, that the rule of law and spending EU funds need to be connected, and then you do nothing, I mean, it will be really a big hit into credibility of the EU in Poland, and be aiming at the part of population which you want to keep the most, that is the Euro enthusiasts who actually look at Europe and think that it will be a source of certain values, not just the money. And if the EU is basically continuing with this phony dialogue, I think that's a very, very dangerous position. So that's what I mean, that the EU has a role to play on the political level, not just supporting civil society, which it should do to a higher degree than it does now. It's another thing. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Jacek. So the message is, to put it very simply, at least in case you are not or cannot support democratic politicians and parties directly, please do not support our government. That might be a message we might agree with. Now, I would like to ask Julie to react very quickly to a problem that might be raised following the situation you described, what is called the Globalbritain aspiration. But do you think that after these very turbulent years of Brexit and transition and taking back control for Britain, and we don't know whether Britain will remain a United Kingdom, but what you think, can we foresee a sort of consolidation between the UK on the one side and the European Union in a couple of years, maybe a more friendlier cooperation because of the historic reasons, geography, and maybe because somehow the atmosphere might change and it's irrational to be somehow in a conflict situation between the two entities? What do you think?
I hope so. I don't know, but I hope so. And the rhetoric is still quite positive about the Franco-British relationship. Clearly, AUKUS was a PR disaster, that it looked as if the UK was just taking trade away from France. That was unhelpful. And the language that the Prime Minister has used at the UN wasn't helpful about strengthening the relationship, however, or keeping the relationship going. But I think that behind the scenes, there is enough dialogue to think that the Franco-British relationship should remain strong. I would hope that there will be some outreach from Germany as soon as the results of the election are known. But I think we're probably looking at the Prime Minister after next, at the very least. So I think we're not likely to see strong British-European relations while Boris Johnson is still Prime Minister, but a subsequent Prime Minister, even a Conservative Prime Minister, could potentially keep those relationships going and strengthen them. But it needs to be, it's going to have a lot more work on the British side, precisely because we're not meeting in the corridors the way we used to at European Council and other meetings.
Okay, thank you, Julie. Certainly we don't know, but we might have a guess. So thanks for your guess, and I hope that will be reality in a couple of years, a more friendly relationship. Well, our time is out, and I would like to thank you all, especially our three presenters, Julie, Oana, and Jacek, for being with us and making their presentations and comments. Unfortunately, this time we did not have time to involve the audience into our debate. We did it in the morning, and hopefully later during the presentations we will have time enough for questions and comments coming from other participants as well. Now I have to finish because we will continue our conference without any break. And the moderator of our next period will be our vice chairperson, Eric Uskiewicz, who is with us from the other side of the Atlantic, actually. And I think more and more people will join us from America and the United States, especially. So anyone who can stay, just don't go away, and we will continue our conference. And thanks again for everybody. I will stay as well, but the floor is yours, Eric. Thank you.
Thank you, István.
Thank
you.